Welcome back to Cross-Cultural Communication and Management. This is Topic 2 of the Introduction Lecture on the Nature of Culture. There are 3 topics in this lecture. With Topic 1, we learned that, because culture is richer, faster, and more dynamic than genes, it has become our survival strategy. Topic 2 will help us to understand what makes culture so rich, fast, and dynamic. The last topic may give us the feeling that genes have no role anymore, since we get the guidance for life from culture. With this topic, we will learn that genes do not lead the game, and they have a very fascinating role in how our culture has evolved. This is the picture I took when I stayed in India for my sabbatical. I was amazed at the diversity I saw in this country. India is a multicultural society. There are so many religions, languages, values, ways of living, and doing business. There are many people with progressive values, and yet, some values are extremely conservative. I used to think that South Africa is very diverse, but I changed my mind when I was in India. So what makes our cultures so diverse? The diversity pathway is a model I constructed to visualize the extreme dynamic of interaction between culture and its drivers. You find it in Chapter 1 of the textbook. For now, let's break this model down a little bit. The first driver that contributes to the diversity of culture is geographic environment. Among the theories, a famous one is called environmental determinism. It proposes that geography determines the physical and intellectual qualities of its inhabitants. For example, back in the 14th century, the famous Arab thinker, Ibn Khaldun, used this theory to argue that it is wrong to say that black skin means the person is cursed. However, things become ugly when the same theory is used to justify that tropical climates made African people uncivilized and lazy. Then came the neo-environmental theory, led by Jared Diamond, and his famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Diamond opposed racism, saying that geography determines political and economic pathways, making a country rich or poor. People in rich countries are not more superior. They are just luckier with their environment. Based on this theory, Hofstede, a very prominent researcher in our field, also suggested that environment is the original cause of cultural diversity. Hot climate contributes to collectivism, because tropical food is abundant. So the main enemy is other competing groups. Cold climate contributes individualism, because people learn to fend for themselves, without being too dependent on more powerful others. Environmental determinism, and even its neo-theories received a lot of criticism. Many scientists rejected the idea that climate almost means destiny. If the place where you were born defines your culture, and you are just a passive product of your culture, then this theory undermines humans' agency. It justifies colonialism, racism, and economic inequality. A much more balanced hypothesis is cultural ecology. It proposes that both humans and environment change each other, and should be an integral part of each other. It makes sense, seeing the way we are alternating landscape, climate, and ecosystems around us. When seeking an answer for the origin of cultural diversity, most literature and studies on cross-cultural communication and management only focus on this link between culture and geography or environment. However, my research proposed a different approach. I visualized this approach with a diagram of diversity pathways. By looking beyond geography, we will explore the drivers of cultural diversity in a way that is more holistic, contextual, and interdisciplinary. So let's have a quick quiz and continue our journey. The second driver of diversity is gene. We don't see genes as the main source of life guidance anymore, but genes don't not just go away. Their new role is fascinating, as the theory of gene culture coevolution suggests. Many thousands of years ago, our ancestors migrated to the equatorial regions of the world, where tropical climates usually means there was a high load of pathogens, bacteria and viruses, that could cause dangerous diseases. In this kind of environment, following group rules, such as how to prepare food, and being sensitive to social cues to avoid danger, can lead to survival benefit. Because culture is our survival strategy, instead of relying on genetic evolution to win over pathogen, humans evolved a group-oriented culture to deal with this environmental challenge. In other words, collectivistic culture serves an anti-pathogen defense function. Those who could fit well into this culture would survive, and have more children. This is where DNA comes in. A number of studies suggest that the shorter version of the serotonin transporter gene is associated with higher level of social sensitivity, both positive and negative events. There is an interesting hypothesis that this genetic variation supports the evolution of group culture, because it makes people more sensitive to the social surrounding. People with this gene had some evolutionary advantages, and so, the gene became dominant in the population. In turn, its dominance then reinforced the cultural values of group orientation. And the gene-culture coevolution theory basically means that useful cultural values can select adaptive genetic variations. And genetic variations, in turn, can reinforce useful cultural values. On the left, you see a map of how this gene, associated with social sensitivity, is distributed around the world. And on the right, is the distribution of the group value. High level of this gene is associated with high level of group orientation or collectivism. To this day, up to 80% of East Asian population carry this gene, while his number is half, among European population. While this specific connection is only a hypothesis, the theory of gene-culture coevolution is widely accepted. And that is why, to a certain extent, we can say that culture is actually genetically inherited. However, I have to add an important note here, and strongly emphasize that it is incorrect to say that this gene leads to group culture or vice versa. The interaction is much more complicated than that, and discussion of this topic is beyond our lecture. The third driver of cultural diversity is inside each of us, our brain. You probably have heard about brain plasticity. So, put it this way, the brain is not completely fixed. Like a muscle, its structures and functions can change with repeated thoughts and behaviors. In the context of this subject, the brain's ability to change allows us to do two things. 1. We can adapt to a new culture, become a product of this culture, taking resource and guidance from it to get our job done. The second thing brain plasticity allows us to do is not adapting to a culture, but changing or creating new cultures, so becoming the producer of the culture. For example, we used to be someone who consumed a lot fast fashion. But we can change ourselves and promote that sustainable change in a wider community. Now when we pass by those stores with fast fashion, our brain doesn't give us anymore that burning desire to come in and check for sale. Its wiring pathway has changed, thanks to brain plasticity. This very cool little video shows membrane-anchored green fluorescent proteins of rat hippocampal neurons, captured in 120-hour time-lapse imaging. Many neurons start off with a few connections and grow into a big network. This is basically what happens in your brain, day in, day out, as we learn new things, create new habits, and adapt to or create a new culture. This video also reminds us to be aware of the direction we are letting our brain build new connections. Do we keep hanging out with those who inspire us or deprive us? Are we watching news that brings us fear or joy? And what newsfeed are we having on social media? These are the bricks to build your brain. So we better choose the material wisely. Here is a simple model I created to make brain's plasticity easier to understand. When two neurons communicate with each other, they don't actually touch each other. Instead, they send neurotransmitters across a small gap and dock on the receptors of their counterpart. The more often you repeat a certain thought, emotion, or behavior, the more neurotransmitters will be sent off. The dendrite will also get bigger to accommodate more receptors. And in the end, there will be a new branch, so to speak. This is how we learn, and change or create a habit. The last thing I would like to mention about brain plasticity is that it allows us to have a multicultural mind. This means you can hold opposing values at the same time and switch between them spontaneously. This is the case for many of us who are global citizens, who have lived in many different countries, or who have a culturally diverse lifestyle. I once saw a good friend of mine, a white European business owner, talking to his Japanese partner on the phone, half the globe away. Without seeing his partner, he not only changed his tone, but he also kept bowing continuously, as if he was talking to this person face to face. Putting the phone down, and he switched back to the friend that I know. Cultivating a multicultural mind is the goal of people who work and live in international context. It may take time until we can do it effortlessly, like the friend I just mentioned. But the good news is, our brain's plasticity allows us to do such a thing. Here is a very interesting experiment to prove the point. The researchers in this study divided their participants into two groups. One group was given a text, in which there were plural pronouns such as we, our, and they. The other group had a text with singular pronouns, such as I, me, mine. After reading the text, they were given a leadership task. The first group preferred transformational leadership, one that emphasizes harmony and consensus. The other group preferred transactional leadership, so the kind of leaders who focus on getting people on task, managing reward, and time allocation. What we learned from this experiment is that simple stimuli such as a short text can trigger the brain to make a switch in value. This effect probably does not last very long, but with time, it may become a habit. The bottom line is, the brain does have the ability to host a multicultural mind. The fourth driver that can influence cultural diversity is our own behaviors. It does this in two ways, indirectly and directly. Let's talk about the indirect way first. The terminology we need here is epigenetics. It is how behaviors can change the way genes work. If you look at the lights in your room right now, they are fixed, and so are our genes. These lights, however, can be turned on or off with a switch. And so are our genes. The switches of genes are proteins, so the blue buttons you see in this picture. They can turn a gene on or off, depending very much on the environment, such as our lifestyle. For example, you may have the genes for intelligence. If life is kind to you, then the genes maximize their impact. But if you live in poverty, or if your family is not supportive, these genes may not express their maximum capacity. The interesting thing about epigenetics is that we inherit this change in how genes works for several generations. If our ancestors follow a certain lifestyle, they may pass some consequences of that lifestyle to us. Think of it this way. If you turn off the lights in your room right now, for the next few days, so a few generations, your family will not have light at all. So in a way, culture is transmitted across generations via the way genes work. Here is a very interesting study, in which the author compared two populations with similar genetic makeups, but live in two different cultures, Puerto Rico and Mexico. Despite the similarity in genes, they have a huge difference in how their genes express. So culture does change the way genes work and pass it on to the next generations. I'm fascinated with epigenetics, so I will introduce you to two more studies on the Dutch famine and the Holocaust. Both events are tragic. But the most tragic finding in these studies is that the trauma was passed on to the third or fourth generations of the victims. Their great-grandchildren still suffered from that impact, even though they did not experience it themselves. So let's pause for a moment and think about the lifestyle you are having. Whatever you do, there is a chance that it will impact your offspring in 100 years. There is a saying that, you are what your grandparents ate. And it is not too far from the truth. Now let's turn to the way behavior can influence cultural diversity in a direct way. In this field of cross-cultural study, there are two main schools of thought. One is the static paradigm. It suggests that culture shapes our behaviors. If you are a typical Dutch, then you would probably eat a lot of cheese, maybe ride a bike, and have some Dutch values. This Dutch culture cannot be changed through behaviors. It's one-way street. We are the product of our culture. The other school of thought is the dynamic paradigm. It suggests that the interaction is both ways. This means, your Dutch culture may shape your behaviors somehow, but collective behaviors can change a culture as well. We are not just a passive product, but also a producer of our culture. For example, we are seeing how young people advocating a new culture of sustainability, that we mentioned before. Here is a good study to understand this. China was famous for enforcing its one-child policy, in order to control its big population. Most people were unhappy with it, since having many children is an important value there. So they reluctantly changed their behavior. However, this repeated behavior eventually changed their original value. Now the ban is lifted, but many people refuse to have second child. The bottom line is, collective behavior can change a culture, even when it's forced. We have come to the end of this very complex topic. I must admit that I have oversimplified many aspects. So I encourage you to question and do further research. For now, let's summarize it. The question we have at the beginning is, what drives the diversity of culture? By incorporating insights from many other disciplines, we know that there are at least 4 drivers. First of all, different environments may influence our culture, and vice versa. Second of all, genes are not separated from culture. To deal with environmental challenges, genes influence culture, which influences genes, which influence culture. We are not quite sure which came first, that's why they co-evolve. Genes do this in 2 ways. Some cultural values useful for survival can be genetically incorporated, which may explain the genetic diversity in different populations, as we see with the case of social sensitivity. However, the much more influential way genes interplay with culture is via epigenetics. What we do can change the way genes work, and this effect can be passed on for several generations. Third of all, the brain has a certain level of flexibility, so we can adapt to a culture, but also can create a new culture by changing our own values and behaviors. Lastly, behaviors can change a culture in an indirect way, through how genes work, and pass this change to the next generations, and in a direct way, through collective behaviors. And so, the diversity pathways of culture proposes that cultural diversity is driven by the following drivers: interaction with the environment, how genes co-evolve with culture and transmit culture through epigenetics, brain's plasticity, that allows us to adapt to and change our culture, and finally, repeated collective behaviors that can change a culture in the end. To understand a culture, we have to look at all these driving forces, which together create a very specific and dynamic context. This is because culture is not just socially learned, but also geographically influenced, genetically inherited, and neurally enabled.